Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about something that most history books kind of gloss over. How a simple flower gradually changed the most powerful empire on Earth. By 1838, China had approximately 12 million people struggling with opium dependency. That's more than the entire population of most countries today. What started as a trade dispute over tea eventually transformed Chinese society in ways no one could have predicted. And it all began with something as ordinary as afternoon tea. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. All right, find that cozy spot, take a nice slow breath, and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. We're heading back to 1830s China, and this is a story about how global trade, cultural misunderstandings, and unintended consequences can reshape entire civilizations. Picture yourself waking up in Beijing, 1830. You're in a modest courtyard house in one of the city's merchant quarters. The morning light filters through paper windows, casting soft shadows across wooden floors that have been polished smooth by generations of feet. The air carries the gentle scent of burning charcoal from kitchen fires, mixed with the sweet aroma of steaming rice and the sharper notes of fermented bean paste somewhere nearby. A street vendor is calling out his wares in the distinctive melodic tone that flows through the morning atmosphere. You're living in what the Chinese call the Celestial Empire, and the name reflects their genuine confidence in their civilization's achievements. China in 1830 represents the culmination of over 2,000 years of continuous cultural development, technological innovation, and administrative refinement. Your house, modest as it is, contains innovations that represent centuries of gradual improvement. The windows are made of translucent paper that lets in light while keeping out wind, a Chinese invention that balances privacy with illumination. The tea you're about to drink comes from plantations that have been cultivating and refining their techniques for generations. The porcelain cup in your hands represents another Chinese innovation, ceramic technology so advanced that European attempts to replicate it remained unsuccessful for centuries. The silk robe you're wearing comes from an industry that has perfected its methods over millennia, creating fabrics of unmatched quality and beauty. Most impressively, you're part of an empire that peacefully governs over 400 million people, roughly a quarter of everyone alive on Earth at this time. The imperial examination system ensures that government officials earn their positions through education and merit, rather than birth or wealth. The Grand Canal system efficiently moves goods and people across vast distances. As you finish your morning tea and step outside into the hutong, the narrow alleyways that form Beijing's neighborhood networks, you join the gentle flow of morning activity. The streets carry merchants wheeling carts loaded with vegetables from surrounding farms, scholars in their distinctive robes walking to morning studies, craftsmen carrying tools that represent generations of accumulated knowledge. The sounds create a symphony of productive activity. The soft clip-clop of horses, the gentle creak of wooden cartwheels, the pleasant chatter of people conducting business, the distant sound of temple bells marking the hours. Children play between the adults, their laughter mixing with the calls of shopkeepers and the rhythmic sounds of craftsmen at work. You make your way toward the main thoroughfare, passing shops that display the products of the world's most sophisticated economy. A silk merchant's stall shows fabrics so fine they seem to capture and hold light itself. A tea shop offers dozens of varieties, each with characteristics developed through centuries of careful cultivation. A ceramics workshop displays vases and bowls formed with such precision they appear almost mathematical in their perfection. This is China in 1830, confident, prosperous, technologically advanced, and completely secure in its position as the world's leading civilization. The empire has everything other nations want: silk, tea, porcelain, spices, and has successfully maintained this advantageous position for centuries. The morning market provides a perfect example of Chinese commercial sophistication. Vendors and customers engage in elaborate negotiations that combine business with social interaction and cultural expression. Prices emerge through complex processes of offers, counter-offers, and eventual agreements that leave both parties feeling respected and fairly treated. An elderly tea merchant notices your interest and invites you to sample his finest blend. His stall is arranged with museum-like precision, dozens of small containers, each holding a different variety of leaf. Organized by region, season, and processing method, he offers you a small cup of tea that represents generations of agricultural knowledge. The tea reveals layers of flavor that unfold gradually as you drink it. It comes from mountain gardens where soil composition, altitude, and weather patterns have been studied and optimized for centuries. The leaves were harvested at precisely the right moment and processed using techniques passed down through generations. "This blend represents 5 generations of my family's knowledge," the merchant says with quiet pride. "My great-great-grandfather developed the basic recipe. Each generation has made small improvements. The result is something that couldn't be created anywhere else in the world. He's not boasting, he's simply acknowledging a reality." Throughout the market, you see this pattern repeated endlessly. Chinese craftsmen have achieved levels of excellence that seem almost beyond human capability. Silk weavers create fabric so fine that yards of material can pass through a wedding ring. Porcelain makers produce ceramics so perfectly fired they ring like bells when gently tapped. Metal workers forge steel so superior that Chinese tools remain sharp for decades. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this empire isn't its technology or wealth. It's its social stability. While European nations experience constant political upheaval and warfare, China has maintained essentially the same governmental system for over 1,000 years. The emperor rules through a vast bureaucracy of educated officials who have earned their positions through rigorous examinations. This stability has allowed Chinese culture to develop a sophistication that encompasses every aspect of human experience. Poetry and painting have reached levels of refinement that express the deepest aspects of human emotion and natural beauty. Philosophy has produced thinkers whose insights into human nature and social organization continue to influence global thought. Even entertainment, opera, storytelling, games, shows a level of development that reflects centuries of peaceful cultural evolution. As you walk through the city, you begin to understand why the Chinese refer to their emperor as the Son of Heaven and their country as the Middle Kingdom. From their perspective, they genuinely are at the center of the civilized world. Around them exist various other societies, including the Europeans, who sometimes send trade missions hoping to acquire Chinese goods. European traders are certainly welcome, but within carefully defined boundaries. They're restricted to a small trading area in Canton, far from the centers of Chinese civilization. They conduct all business through Chinese intermediaries, follow Chinese law, and maintain respectful attitudes toward Chinese authority. From the Chinese perspective, this arrangement makes perfect sense. Foreign visitors should feel grateful for the privilege of interacting with Chinese civilization. What the Chinese don't yet understand is that these European visitors have been developing new approaches to international relations based on different principles than those that have sustained Chinese success. While Chinese civilization has perfected the arts of cultural development and peaceful administration, European nations have been focusing on maritime technology and global commerce. But in 1830, these differences aren't yet apparent. You're experiencing life in the most successful and stable civilization in human history, surrounded by evidence of Chinese excellence in virtually every field of human endeavor. The idea that this empire could face serious challenges from foreign influence would seem not just unlikely but almost impossible to imagine. The afternoon brings you to the Temple of Heaven, where you join hundreds of other citizens in daily rituals that connect earthly life to cosmic order. The architecture itself demonstrates Chinese understanding of harmony and proportion, each element perfectly balanced, every detail meaningful, the entire structure creating a sense of peace that seems to emerge from the very stones. As the sun begins to set, you make your way home through hutongs, now illuminated by the warm light of paper lanterns. Families are gathering for evening meals. Children are playing traditional games that have entertained young people for centuries, and elderly men are engaged in thoughtful discussions of poetry and philosophy. Your own evening meal consists of dishes that represent the world's most sophisticated cuisine. Rice, perfectly steamed, vegetables precisely cut and briefly cooked to maintain their color and texture. Small portions of meat prepared with sauces that balance sweet, sour, salty, and spicy elements in harmonious combinations. After dinner, you join your neighbors in the courtyard for the evening's entertainment. A traveling storyteller who recounts tales from Chinese history and literature. His performance demonstrates mastery of dramatic arts, complete with different voices for each character. sound effects created with simple props, and audience participation that makes even familiar stories feel fresh and engaging. As the evening winds down and you prepare for sleep, you're struck by the profound contentment that characterizes life in this empire. People understand their roles in society, appreciate their duties and obligations, and find meaning in contributing to a civilization that has proven its worth over millennia. The bed you rest on is firm but comfortable. The blanket's woven from silk that naturally regulates temperature. The pillow filled with materials that provide optimal support. Even rest, in this empire, has been refined through centuries of attention to comfort and health. Outside your window, the city settles into its nightly rhythm. Night watchmen begin their rounds, calling out the hours and weather conditions. Craftsmen put away their tools for the day. Students continue reading by oil lamp light, memorizing classical texts that will qualify them for government service. This is China in 1830, peaceful, prosperous, confident in its achievements, completely unprepared for the changes that global commerce will soon bring to every corner of the world. You wake the next morning to find yourself in Canton, the only Chinese port where foreign merchants are permitted to conduct business. The year is 1830, and you're about to observe the beginning of a global trade situation that will eventually reshape international relations. Canton in 1830 demonstrates how China manages foreign contact while maintaining control over foreign influence. The Chinese have established what they call the Canton system, a carefully designed arrangement that allows them to benefit from international trade while preserving their cultural independence. European and American merchants are restricted to a narrow area along the Pearl River, outside the city walls, where they live and work in buildings called factories, not manufacturing facilities, but trading posts. This arrangement allows for commercial exchange while preventing foreign customs from spreading into Chinese society. Standing on the wharf, you can observe the fundamental nature of global trade relationships at this time. European ships arrive carrying silver, mostly Mexican silver. Since Spain's American colonies produce much of the world's silver supply, the silver moves into Chinese warehouses. Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, and especially tea, move on to the European ships. This might appear to be a simple, mutually beneficial exchange, but there's an underlying issue that has been developing for decades. Europeans desire Chinese products far more intensely than Chinese people desire European products. China is largely self-sufficient, producing everything its people need and want. European manufactured goods seem unnecessary to Chinese consumers who already have access to superior local alternatives. The result is that silver flows into China in substantial quantities, while very little flows back out. European merchants are essentially spending vast amounts of their continent's primary currency to purchase Chinese goods, while finding few Chinese customers for European products. You observe this pattern as another ship arrives from London, its cargo hold filled with silver bars that will soon enter the Chinese economy. The European merchants watching the unloading process show expressions of concern mixed with resignation. They're profiting from selling Chinese goods in Europe, but they're also watching their continent's monetary reserves flow steadily eastward. One of these merchants, a Scottish businessman named Morrison who represents the English East India Company, explains the situation while observing the cargo transfer. Several million pounds of silver each year, he says, shaking his head thoughtfully, flowing into China with very little flowing back out. We need to find products that Chinese consumers genuinely want to purchase. Morrison represents the East India Company, the massive trading corporation that manages much of British commerce throughout Asia. The company has been searching for years for anything that Chinese consumers might want to buy in significant quantities. They've tried European manufactured goods, but Chinese craftsmen produce superior versions of most items. They've attempted to introduce exotic products from other regions, but Chinese merchants can usually source similar items more economically from closer sources. What they're looking for is a product that Chinese consumers will not just want, but feel they need, something that creates its own expanding demand. That product is opium. The poppy plant has been cultivated in India for many years. Primarily for medical purposes, opium, the dried resin from poppy pods, serves as an effective pain reliever and sleep aid when used in small, controlled quantities. The East India Company has recently begun producing it in larger quantities in their Indian territories. More significantly, They've discovered that there's already a small but growing market for opium in China. Some Chinese use it for medical purposes, others occasionally for relaxation, and a few have developed regular usage patterns. What the British are beginning to consider is whether this small market might be expanded into a larger one through improved distribution and marketing. You follow Morrison through the narrow streets of the foreign quarter, past American and Dutch trading posts, past the small community of European families who live in this unique international enclave. The buildings here combine European and Chinese architectural elements, Western-style furniture inside Chinese-style structures, European gardens planted according to Chinese principles of balance and harmony. Morrison leads you to a warehouse where you witness something that will eventually reshape global trade. The early planning stages of what will become a major international commerce operation, though its full implications aren't yet clear to anyone involved. Inside the warehouse, representatives from various trading companies gather around maps and charts. They're discussing routes, prices, and distribution methods with the systematic approach of business planners, which is exactly what they are, though the long-term consequences of their planning will extend far beyond simple commerce. The key principle, explains a company official named Jardine, is to begin gradually and carefully. We introduce opium as a premium product, marketed to affluent Chinese customers who appreciate the finest of everything. We emphasize its exotic origins, its rarity, its association with sophistication and international awareness. Jardine spreads out a map of China's river systems. Once we've established opium as desirable among educated and wealthy customers, we can expand distribution through these waterways. Chinese merchants, motivated by normal business interests, will handle the actual sales and customer relationships. We maintain appropriate distance while the distribution networks develop naturally. Another merchant, named Matheson, indicates specific locations on the map. We've identified key points where river commerce converges. Small quantities of opium introduced at these locations will spread organically through existing commercial networks within several years. We estimate we could develop a market of perhaps several 100,000 occasional users. You observe these men carefully planning what they see as a solution to a business problem. They're not intentionally malicious. They're simply businessmen applying contemporary commercial methods to the challenge of expanding international trade. The fact that their plans will eventually have significant social consequences isn't something they're focusing on at this stage. What's notable about their approach is its sophistication. These aren't simple traders operating without much planning. They're educated, intelligent men applying systematic business methods to the challenge of creating new markets. They understand customer psychology, distribution logistics, and pricing strategies. The attractive aspect of this particular product, Matheson continues, is that it naturally creates customer loyalty. People who try opium often find it helpful and want to purchase it again. It's an ideal commercial product, demand that tends to increase over time rather than decrease. As the meeting continues, you begin to understand the scope of what's being considered. This isn't just about selling a new product to Chinese customers. It's about fundamentally changing the balance of international trade by creating Chinese demand for a British-controlled product. If successful, opium sales could offset the silver drain that has been challenging European economies while creating new revenue streams for British commerce. The meeting concludes with agreements about cooperation and resource sharing. These men return to their comfortable quarters in the foreign district, where they'll enjoy Chinese cuisine served by Chinese staff before retiring to beds furnished with Chinese silk. Tomorrow, they'll begin implementing business plans that they view as normal commercial development. You leave the warehouse with mixed feelings about what you've observed. The narrow streets of the foreign quarter now seem more complex than they first appeared. Every Chinese face you see represents a potential participant in the expanding trade relationships that these foreign merchants are developing. That evening, you find yourself in a tea house frequented by Chinese merchants who work with foreign traders. The conversations you overhear reveal that some Chinese are already aware of the opium trade's existence, but they view it as a minor curiosity rather than something significant. Foreign merchants are importing some kind of medicinal product, one merchant tells another. They say it helps with pain and sleep difficulties. There's a small market for it among wealthy customers who like to try interesting foreign items. His companion nods with mild interest. Foreigners and their unusual products, as long as they continue buying our tea and silk. Their other business activities don't particularly concern us. If some customers want to try foreign medicine, that's their personal choice. This attitude, viewing opium as simply another foreign curiosity, represents how most Chinese authorities initially approach the developing trade. Chinese society has centuries of experience successfully incorporating foreign influences while maintaining its essential character. Why should this situation be any different? What they don't yet understand is that opium represents a different type of foreign influence than anything China has previously encountered. Previous foreign products were simply alternatives to existing Chinese goods. Opium creates entirely new types of customer relationships that operate according to different principles than traditional commerce. As you walk home through Canton's evening streets, you pass small groups of Chinese men gathered around oil lamps, some of them smoking pipes filled with a dark substance. These are early opium users, and their behavior shows some differences from typical evening social activities. They move more slowly than usual, speak more quietly, and seem more withdrawn from their immediate surroundings. Their eyes have a distant quality that suggests they're experiencing something different from ordinary social interaction. Most notably, they're spending money on a product that costs considerably more than most Chinese recreational activities. One of these early users approaches you, apparently mistaking you for a potential customer. "Would you like to try the foreign medicine?" he asks quietly. It's quite helpful for worry and discomfort. Makes everything feel more peaceful. His hands show a slight tremor as he speaks. And you notice that his teeth are beginning to show some discoloration, early signs of the dental issues that can develop with regular opium use. He's probably been using the substance for less than a year, but it already seems to have become an important part of his routine. Where do you obtain it? You ask, curious about the distribution methods. He gestures toward the foreign quarter. Chinese merchants purchase it from British traders. The price keeps increasing, but once you discover its benefits, you find it difficult to do without. The body seems to require it like it requires food or water. This conversation provides insight into how opium differs from other products. While most commercial goods satisfy existing needs or wants, opium creates new types of needs that didn't exist before people tried it. This characteristic will eventually make it a very different type of international trade product than tea, silk, or porcelain. As you reach your lodgings, you reflect on the complexity of the commercial relationships you've observed. Foreign merchants are developing new business opportunities that they view as normal international trade expansion. Chinese authorities see these developments as minor foreign commercial activities that don't significantly affect Chinese interests. Chinese customers view opium as an interesting foreign product that some people enjoy trying. None of these perspectives fully anticipates how this particular form of international commerce will eventually develop. The men planning opium distribution strategies see it as a solution to trade balance problems. Chinese officials see it as a minor foreign business matter. Chinese customers see it as a personal lifestyle choice. But opium commerce operates according to different principles than other forms of international trade. And these differences will eventually reshape relationships between China and the outside world in ways that no one currently imagines. You awaken 5 years later in 1835 to find yourself in a riverside town about 50 miles inland from Canton. The changes that have occurred during this time period are immediately noticeable. Where once you might have woken to the sounds of productive morning activity, craftsmen beginning their work, merchants conducting business, children playing in the streets, now you wake to an atmosphere that feels somehow different. The opium trade has expanded exactly as the British merchants anticipated, following China's river systems and spreading gradually into the interior regions. What began as a curiosity for wealthy customers in Canton has developed into a more widespread phenomenon affecting various levels of Chinese society. You step outside into the morning air and notice a sweet, distinctive smell that has become common in Chinese towns, the aroma of opium smoke. It drifts from windows and doorways, creating a subtle haze that seems to soften sounds and blur the sharp edges of morning light. The main street, which 5 years ago would have been busy with commerce by this hour, moves at a noticeably slower pace. Shop fronts that once displayed the finest products of Chinese craftsmanship now show signs of reduced activity. Some have been converted to different purposes, while others operate with obviously diminished inventory and fewer customers. You make your way to what was once the town's central market, now clearly less active than it was previously. Where dozens of vendors once competed to offer the highest quality goods, only about half that number remain. Their products show signs of reduced attention to detail, items that are functional but lack the exceptional quality that traditionally characterized Chinese craftsmanship. An elderly man who sells rice notices your expression of concern. You haven't visited recently, he observes. Things have become more challenging. Many people in town now use the foreign medicine regularly. Craftsmen have become less reliable. Farmers sometimes neglect their work. Even some local officials, he pauses. But you understand what he's suggesting. The changes have affected people in positions of responsibility, including those whose duties involve maintaining community standards and social order. You decide to observe one of the opium establishments that have appeared throughout the town. The building was once a silk workshop. You can still see the structural supports where looms previously operated. Now it houses rows of wooden platforms where users rest in various stages of relaxation and withdrawal from daily concerns. The scene inside suggests a form of social activity that's quite different from traditional Chinese community gathering places. Dozens of people, including both men and some women, lie on wooden benches, sharing pipes filled with the dark substance that has become increasingly central to their daily routines. Some are clearly wealthy merchants, recognizable by the fine silk clothing they still wear. Others appear to be laborers, farmers, even scholars. The substance seems to appeal to people from various social backgrounds. The atmosphere is thick with sweet smoke and the quiet sounds of people breathing slowly and speaking in subdued tones. What strikes you most is the age range of the users. The British marketing approach has been effective at reaching across different generations. You see elderly people who probably first tried opium for legitimate medical purposes and gradually developed regular usage patterns. You see middle-aged merchants who were likely introduced to the substance during business dealings with foreign traders. You also see younger people, probably introduced by friends or family members who were already users. The establishment is managed by a Chinese man named Chen, who moves among the users with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to operate a successful business. He's clearly not himself a user. His eyes are alert, his movements purposeful. But his livelihood has become dependent on serving people who use opium regularly. Business has been quite good, he tells you with professional satisfaction. 5 years ago, I might have served 1 or 2 customers per day, mostly wealthy people trying something exotic. Now I serve over 100 regular customers. I've had to expand the facility 3 times. Chen shows you his supply of opium, stored in ceramic containers that once held tea or spices. The substance itself looks unremarkable, dark brown material that could be mistaken for various other organic products. But each container represents a substantial investment and generates significant ongoing revenue. The foreign merchants have made distribution quite straightforward, Chen continues. They provide consistent supplies. We handle customer relationships. Everyone benefits from the arrangement. Our customers certainly seem satisfied with the service. He appears to genuinely believe that he's providing something people want and appreciate. The idea that his business might be contributing to social problems doesn't seem to have occurred to him. Or perhaps he's learned to focus on the commercial aspects rather than the broader implications. We also provide credit arrangements for regular customers who experience temporary financial difficulties, he adds. Since usage tends to be quite consistent, we can extend credit with confidence that people will repay when they obtain income. This credit system represents an interesting development in the opium trade. Chinese entrepreneurs have begun creating financial relationships that extend beyond simple cash transactions. They're learning to work with the predictable nature of regular opium use to develop business models that maximize customer loyalty and revenue. You leave the establishment and continue exploring the town, observing the changes that 5 years of expanded opium availability have produced. The effects are visible in many places, though they're subtle enough that someone unfamiliar with the town's previous condition might not immediately recognize them as symptoms of social change. The local temple, once a center of community activity, now operates with obviously reduced participation. The monks mention that donations have decreased significantly as families redirect their spending toward other priorities. More concerning, some of the religious personnel themselves have begun using opium. which affects their ability to provide spiritual leadership. The school where local children once learned classical literature and mathematics has reduced its operations considerably. The teacher, previously a respected scholar, has developed personal difficulties that affect his ability to maintain educational standards. The children who should be receiving education instead help their families with various income-generating activities. You observe the gradual breakdown of family structures that have traditionally been the foundation of Chinese social organization. Chinese culture places enormous emphasis on family loyalty and mutual support between generations. But opium usage has created situations where these traditional relationships become strained. You witness this social change in the home of a merchant named Wu, who once operated a successful ceramics business throughout the region. Wu began using opium 3 years ago as an occasional indulgence, something to share with business associates during negotiations. Now his usage has become central to his daily routine, affecting his business operations and family relationships. Wu's wife has moved with their younger children to live with her relatives in a village that hasn't been significantly affected by opium availability. Their eldest son, however, remained with his father and has also begun using the substance regularly. You observe father and son discussing which of their remaining possessions might be sold to purchase tomorrow's opium supply. They're approaching the disposal of family property with the same practical efficiency that their ancestors might have used for normal business planning. "We still have grandfather's calligraphy collection," the son suggests. "A collector in the next town might pay well for those pieces." Wu nods thoughtfully. "And there's your mother's jewelry case. She left it behind when she moved. The craftsmanship alone should have value." They're discussing the sale of items that represent their family's cultural heritage with calm rationality, treating these transactions as normal business decisions rather than the disposal of irreplaceable family treasures. This pattern is occurring throughout the region as opium usage becomes more common. Traditional practices, cultural objects, and social relationships that have preserved Chinese civilization for generations are being gradually reorganized around the need to maintain regular access to opium. The regional government officials are aware that changes are occurring, but they're uncertain about how to address them effectively. Traditional Chinese administration focuses on maintaining social harmony through education, moral guidance, and appropriate punishment of antisocial behavior. But opium usage doesn't fit easily into these established categories. You attend a meeting of local officials where these challenges are discussed with increasing concern. The magistrate, a scholarly man in his 50s, explains the administrative difficulties clearly. "Our laws and procedures were developed to handle problems that arise naturally within Chinese society. We have effective methods for managing disputes between neighbors, commercial disagreements, tax collection issues, even occasional civil disturbances. But this opium situation originates outside our society and creates behaviors we don't fully understand." His assistant, a younger man who has been investigating the opium trade, provides additional details. The foreign merchants claim they're simply conducting normal business with willing customers. They argue that if Chinese people choose to purchase opium, that represents personal decisions rather than foreign influence. But my observations suggest they're deliberately targeting specific groups. First, wealthy people, to establish opium as a status symbol, then others, to expand the customer base. The magistrate struggles with this information. If foreign merchants are deliberately attempting to influence Chinese behavior, that could be considered a form of outside interference. But if Chinese people are simply making personal lifestyle choices, that's a matter for education and moral guidance rather than legal intervention. How do we determine which interpretation is accurate? This uncertainty at the administrative level allows the opium trade to continue expanding while officials debate appropriate response strategies. Chinese bureaucrats, trained to handle complex social problems through established procedures, find themselves uncertain about how to classify and address a challenge that doesn't fit clearly into traditional categories. Meanwhile, British merchants continue developing their operations with systematic efficiency. They've learned to work with Chinese commercial networks, local customs, and regional preferences. When authorities in one area become concerned about opium sales, the merchants adjust their distribution methods or shift operations to different locations. You spend your evening in a tea house that represents one of the remaining spaces where traditional Chinese social interaction continues largely unchanged. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Zhang, has managed to maintain her establishment's traditional character through careful attention to her customer base and community relationships. It's like watching a beautiful garden gradually change as different plants take root, she tells you, while serving tea that represents centuries of cultivation and refinement. Some changes happen slowly, almost imperceptibly, others occur more quickly. You try to maintain what seems valuable while adapting to new conditions, Mrs. Zhang has observed the transformation of her community with the perspective of someone who remembers previous conditions. She describes families that once gathered regularly for traditional celebrations, now often separated by different priorities and schedules. She recalls scholars who once debated philosophy and literature, now often preoccupied with other interests. She notes craftsmen whose skills represented generations of accumulated knowledge, now sometimes distracted from their traditional work. The most challenging aspect, she says, is that people often seem quite content with these changes. The substance appears to provide relief from various forms of worry and discomfort. Many users report feeling more peaceful and satisfied than they felt previously. How do you suggest alternatives to people who believe their current situation is an improvement? This observation touches on one of the most complex aspects of the opium situation. Many users genuinely feel that opium has improved their quality of life. The substance provides relief from physical pain, emotional anxiety, and social stress. For many people, regular opium use feels like a positive personal choice rather than a problem requiring correction. As you prepare for sleep in your room above Mrs. Zhang's tea house, you reflect on the complexity of what you've observed. In just 5 years, the gradual expansion of opium availability has begun to influence social patterns that took centuries to develop. The changes are occurring slowly enough that they don't create obvious disruption, but consistently enough that they're reshaping community life in fundamental ways. The most significant aspect of this transformation is that it's being driven by individual choices rather than external force. Chinese people are choosing to try opium, choosing to use it regularly, and choosing to reorganize their lives around maintaining access to it. Foreign merchants are facilitating these choices rather than imposing them. This makes the situation particularly difficult for traditional Chinese authorities to address. Their administrative methods were developed to handle problems created by outside coercion or antisocial behavior. But opium use represents personal decisions made by people who often feel their choices are beneficial. Outside your window, the town settles into an evening rhythm that's noticeably different from traditional Chinese community life. Where once evenings might have included family gatherings, social conversations, and cultural activities, now there's more emphasis on individual relaxation and private consumption of substances that provide personal satisfaction. The change isn't dramatic enough to represent obvious social breakdown, but it's consistent enough to suggest that fundamental patterns of Chinese community life are gradually shifting in response to new opportunities and influences that didn't exist a generation ago. You wake up in 1838 in the port city of Canton, and the transformation has become impossible to ignore. The systematic British effort to create Chinese demand for opium has succeeded beyond their initial projections. What began as a solution to European trade balance problems has become an economic phenomenon that's reshaping relationships between China and the outside world. The statistics are remarkable in their scope. Conservative estimates suggest that China now has over 12 million people who use opium regularly. That's roughly equivalent to the entire population of most European countries. But these numbers don't capture the full significance of the change, because many of these users represent the economic and social leadership of Chinese society. Government officials, successful merchants, skilled craftsmen, military officers, scholars, and heads of families. You're staying in a guest house near Canton's Foreign Quarter, and the morning view from your window illustrates the economic transformation in clear visual terms. Where once you might have seen Chinese merchants arriving with carts full of silk, tea and porcelain to trade for foreign silver, now you see Chinese merchants arriving with silver to trade for opium. The economic flow that sustained Chinese prosperity for centuries has completely reversed direction. Instead of foreign silver flowing into China to pay for Chinese goods, Chinese silver is flowing out of China to pay for foreign products. The silver drain that once challenged European economies has become a silver outflow that's affecting Chinese financial stability. You make your way to the trading quarter where British merchants conduct their business, and the transformation is immediately apparent. 5 years ago, these men were searching desperately for products that Chinese consumers might want to purchase. Now they're managing enormous demand for their single most successful product. The opium storage facilities that once held modest quantities now occupy acres of waterfront property. Entire ships arrive loaded primarily with opium from Indian production facilities. Chinese workers, many of them showing signs of personal opium use, handle tons of the substance with industrial efficiency. You encounter Jardine, one of the British merchants you met years earlier, when the opium trade was beginning to develop. His personal transformation reflects that of the industry itself. Where once he seemed like a businessman trying to solve a commercial challenge, he now appears as someone managing a global enterprise. Extraordinary year, he tells you, gesturing toward the busy warehouses. We're moving more opium in a month than we used to handle in an entire year. Chinese demand for the product has far exceeded our most optimistic business projections. Jardine shows you commercial records that document the scale of the trade with corporate precision. In 1838 alone, British merchants have imported over 40,000 chests of opium into China, each chest containing approximately 140 pounds of the substance. That represents roughly 2.8 million pounds of opium in a single year, enough to supply millions of regular users with consistent access. But the most significant figures in Jardine's records relate to financial flows. The opium trade is now generating more revenue than most other forms of international commerce. Chinese customers are paying substantial prices for a product that costs relatively little to produce, creating profit margins that make other business enterprises seem modest by comparison. The remarkable aspect of the situation, Jardine explains with professional satisfaction, is that we've created a self-sustaining market relationship. Chinese demand for opium now generates sufficient revenue to purchase all the Chinese goods we want: silk, tea, porcelain, while still producing substantial profits. We've achieved a balanced trade relationship that benefits everyone involved. What he doesn't mention explicitly, though his records make it clear, is that they've achieved this balance by creating Chinese expenditures that transfer Chinese wealth to British accounts at unprecedented rates. Chinese silver reserves, accumulated over centuries of successful international trade, are being systematically transferred to foreign control. You leave Jardine's offices and explore the Chinese sections of Canton, where the economic transformation is visible in everyday transactions. Families that once lived comfortably on income from traditional occupations are now redirecting significant portions of their budgets toward opium purchases. The pawn shops that once dealt primarily in luxury items, jewelry, art, fine clothing, now handle a constant stream of transactions from people who need cash for opium purchases. You observe as a middle-aged scholar considers selling his personal library, books that represent generations of accumulated knowledge for a fraction of their cultural value. 15 taels of silver for the complete collection, the pawnbroker offers, naming a price that represents only a small portion of what the books would have commanded 5 years earlier. The scholar hesitates, clearly understanding the significance of what he's contemplating. These books were inherited from his father and grandfather, representing his family's intellectual heritage, but the financial pressures of maintaining regular opium access make such decisions increasingly common. "I'll accept the offer," he says finally, "and you witness centuries of cultural accumulation being converted into cash for immediate consumption." This scene occurs throughout the city with variations. A silk merchant considers selling equipment that her family has operated for generations. A ceramics craftsman evaluates his tools and workspace. A tea trader contemplates exchanging his remaining inventory for ready cash. Each transaction represents not just immediate financial pressure, but the gradual conversion of productive assets into consumption expenditures. What makes these transactions particularly significant is their cumulative effect on Chinese economic capacity. When families sell productive assets to purchase opium, they reduce their ability to generate future income. A craftsman without proper tools cannot maintain traditional quality standards. A merchant without inventory cannot conduct normal business. A scholar without books cannot teach or continue research. You decide to visit one of the government administrative offices to understand how official China is responding to these changes. The building shows signs of reduced maintenance, paint somewhat faded, grounds less carefully tended, an atmosphere that suggests financial constraints. Inside, you meet with Regional Administrator Liu, a man in his 40s who represents the educated class that has traditionally governed China. His appearance maintains proper standards, traditional robes correctly worn, bearing dignified and composed. But his expression carries a weariness that suggests he's dealing with problems that exceed normal administrative challenges. We are managing a situation that our governmental systems were never designed to address, he tells you with the frankness of someone who has tried conventional solutions without success. Our administrative methods assume that people will make decisions based on their long-term interests and social responsibilities. But opium usage creates decision-making patterns that seem to override these normal considerations. Administrator Liu shows you reports from districts throughout his region, and the information reveals consistent patterns. Tax collection becoming more difficult as people spend money on opium instead of saving for tax payments. Traditional industries experiencing reduced productivity as workers become less reliable. Social institutions, struggling as community leaders, develop personal problems that affect their public responsibilities. We've attempted various approaches, he continues. We've tried to educate people about the potential problems associated with opium use. We've established regulations for sellers and users. We've attempted to provide alternative forms of recreation and medicine. The results have been limited. The appeal of opium seems to be stronger than traditional forms of social influence. The reports on Administrator Liu's desk document how traditional Chinese governmental methods prove insufficient when applied to situations involving regular substance use, moral education, which has successfully influenced Chinese behavior for centuries, seems less effective against the personal satisfaction that opium provides. Legal regulations which normally encourage social compliance are often ignored by people whose primary concern is maintaining access to opium. Even family pressure, historically a powerful influence in Chinese society, loses effectiveness when substance use becomes central to people's daily routines. Perhaps most concerning, Administrator Liu reveals that the situation has begun to affect government operations themselves. Officials at various levels are developing personal opium usage patterns that influence their professional effectiveness and create opportunities for administrative problems. Last month, I had to reassign 3 assistant administrators because their personal opium use was affecting their work performance, he admits. They weren't deliberately neglecting their duties. They were dealing with personal situations that made consistent work difficult. But the result is reduced administrative capacity when we most need effective governance. This development represents a particularly challenging aspect of the opium situation. As government officials develop personal usage patterns, they become less effective at developing and implementing policies to address the broader social implications of opium availability. The administrative system that might solve the problem becomes part of the problem itself. You leave the administrative office and walk through Canton's commercial district, observing how the economic transformation affects traditional Chinese industries. Businesses that once formed the foundation of Chinese prosperity show signs of reduced activity and declining standards. Silk workshops operate with fewer workers because too many skilled employees have become unreliable due to personal opium use. Tea merchants struggle to maintain traditional quality standards because their suppliers and customers are more focused on immediate transactions than on long-term relationship building. Porcelain makers find their most experienced artisans selling their tools and expertise for ready cash. Most significantly, you observe the breakdown of apprenticeship systems that have preserved Chinese craftsmanship for generations. Master craftsmen who once took pride in training young workers to maintain traditional techniques are now often too preoccupied with personal concerns to teach effectively. Young people who might once have spent years learning sophisticated skills instead seek immediate employment that provides money for current consumption. At a silk workshop that once employed 50 workers and produced fabric renowned throughout Asia, you find only 15 people still working, and several of them show signs of reduced focus and energy. The master weaver, whose family has worked silk for 8 generations, explains the situation with the resignation of someone who has watched traditional standards decline despite his best efforts. We used to create silk so fine that foreign merchants competed to purchase from us at premium prices, he says, examining fabric that clearly doesn't meet the standards his workshop once maintained. Now we produce what we can with available workers, and we're satisfied when merchants purchase our products at reasonable prices. The economic implications extend far beyond individual businesses. China's position in global trade was based on producing goods of such superior quality that other nations willingly paid premium prices to obtain them. But opium-related changes in workforce reliability and customer priorities are systematically affecting the quality standards that made Chinese products globally competitive. European merchants, who once competed intensely for access to Chinese goods, now find themselves in stronger negotiating positions. Chinese producers, needing immediate cash for various purposes, often accept lower prices for products that don't meet traditional quality standards. The economic relationship that once strongly favored China has shifted toward greater balance, though not necessarily in ways that benefit Chinese long-term interests. You end your day at the Kohong, the official association of Chinese merchants authorized to trade with foreigners. This institution once represented Chinese commercial sophistication at its highest level. The merchant families who belonged to the Kohong were among the wealthiest and most respected people in China. Serving as intermediaries between Chinese civilization and international commerce, now the Kohong headquarters feels somewhat less vibrant than in previous years. Some merchant families have experienced financial difficulties related to opium expenditures, either their own or those of key family members. Those who remain financially stable struggle to maintain traditional business relationships while adapting to changing market conditions. You meet with one of the Kohong merchants, a man named Haokua, who represents one of the families that have managed to maintain their traditional business practices despite changing circumstances. His perspective on recent developments is particularly valuable because he has direct experience with both traditional and current conditions. 5 years ago, foreign merchants approached us with great respect, hoping we would agree to sell them small quantities of our finest goods, he recalls. They waited patiently for appointments, accepted whatever prices we established, and felt fortunate to be permitted to trade with Chinese suppliers. Haokua gestures toward the window, where British merchants can be seen conducting business with considerable confidence and efficiency. Now they approach us as business partners rather than as supplicants. They've developed alternative sources of revenue that make them less dependent on Chinese goods, and they know it gives them stronger negotiating positions. The most challenging aspect of Haokua's situation is that he understands how this transformation occurred. He observed British merchants systematically developing Chinese demand for opium, using that demand to generate revenue that reduced their dependence on traditional Chinese trade advantages, and leveraging their improved position to reshape commercial relationships. The sophisticated aspect of their business strategy, he observes, is that they've created a situation where Chinese people voluntarily participate in changing the economic relationship. Chinese merchants distribute opium. Chinese customers create demand for it. Chinese officials accommodate the trade. We cannot blame foreign pressure because the changes result from Chinese choices, even though those choices were influenced by foreign marketing. As evening settles over Canton, you walk back to your lodgings through streets that reflect the economic transformation you've been observing. Buildings that once housed thriving traditional businesses now accommodate different types of enterprises. Families that once gathered in courtyards for evening socializing now often pursue individual activities. Young people who should be learning traditional skills instead engage in various schemes to generate immediate income. The sounds of the city have changed as well, where once evenings included the productive noise of workshops continuing their work, the social conversation of families and neighbors, and the cultural activities of an active urban civilization. Now there's more emphasis on individual pursuits and quieter forms of entertainment. In your room, you reflect on the scope of what you've witnessed. In less than a decade, changes in international trade patterns have begun to affect a civilization that took thousands of years to develop. The speed of the transformation suggests that even very stable societies can experience rapid change when economic incentives shift in fundamental ways. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the situation is that it represents choices rather than coercion. Chinese people are choosing to try opium, choosing to use it regularly, and choosing to reorganize their economic priorities around maintaining access to it. Foreign merchants are facilitating these choices and profiting from them, but they're not forcing them. This makes the situation particularly complex for traditional Chinese authorities to address. Their governmental methods were designed to handle problems created by external threats or internal antisocial behavior. But opium use represents personal decisions made by people who often feel their choices are improving their quality of life. Outside your window, Canton settles into the rhythm of a city whose economic foundation has quietly shifted from traditional Chinese strengths toward accommodation of international market forces. The changes aren't dramatic enough to represent obvious crisis, but they're consistent enough to suggest that the relationship between China and the outside world is being fundamentally restructured through apparently voluntary commercial relationships. You wake up in Beijing in March 1839, and for the first time in years, there's a sense of renewed energy and purpose in the air. The Daoguang Emperor has finally recognized the full scope of the opium situation and has appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu to address the trade comprehensively and decisively. Lin Zexu represents the best qualities of Chinese civilization. He's intellectually brilliant, personally incorruptible, deeply educated in both classical literature and practical administration, and completely dedicated to serving the public interest rather than pursuing private advantage. If anyone can develop effective solutions to the opium challenge, it's this man. You join a crowd gathered outside the Forbidden City to hear the public reading of Commissioner Lin's appointment decree. The document demonstrates Chinese administrative writing at its finest, outlining both the nature of the current situation and the government's commitment to addressing it systematically. The opium trade has become a serious challenge to the well-being of our people, the decree states. What began as international commerce has developed into a situation that affects Chinese social stability and economic health. We will address this challenge through comprehensive measures that protect our people while maintaining appropriate relationships with foreign merchants. The crowd's response reveals the relief that many Chinese feel at finally having leadership willing to confront the situation directly. For years, people have watched their communities and institutions affected by opium-related changes, while government responses remained cautious and limited. Now they have a leader committed to decisive action. You follow the crowd as news of Lin Zexu's appointment spreads through Beijing, in tea houses, markets, and workshops. Conversations focus on similar themes: hope that effective policies will finally be implemented, concern about foreign merchants who have created the current situation, and determination to support whatever measures prove necessary to restore Chinese social stability. At a tea house near the Temple of Heaven, you join a discussion among scholars, merchants, and government officials about the challenges Commissioner Lin will face. Their conversation reveals both the sophistication of Chinese policy analysis and the complexity of the problems that even excellent policies must address. The fundamental difficulty, observes a scholar named Wang, is that we're not dealing with ordinary commercial relationships. The British merchants who import opium operate under the protection of their government and international law. Any measures we implement may be interpreted as interference with legitimate international trade. His companion, a merchant who has observed how opium affects traditional industries, responds with the frustration of someone who has experienced the consequences directly. But we're already experiencing interference with our social and economic systems. How is protecting our people different from protecting our sovereignty? A government official provides the perspective of someone who understands international relations. The British have economic and military capabilities we must consider carefully. Their maritime technology is advanced. Their global commercial networks are extensive, and their financial resources, enhanced by profits from various international trades, are substantial. We must develop policies that achieve our objectives without creating conflicts we might not be able to manage successfully. This discussion between immediate action and careful strategy reflects the complexity of the situation Commissioner Lin faces. He must address a trade that has become central to British imperial finances while avoiding confrontations that could escalate beyond diplomatic management. You decide to travel to Canton, where Commissioner Lin has established his headquarters, and where policies addressing the opium trade will be implemented. The journey south provides opportunities to observe how the situation has developed throughout Chinese society. Every town and village along the route shows evidence of opium-related changes in rural areas. Where traditional agriculture once provided stable livelihoods for farming families, you see abandoned fields as farmers migrate to cities seeking alternative income sources. Traditional craft industries that once flourished in small towns have reduced their operations as skilled workers become less reliable. Most concerning, You observe changes in traditional Chinese social structures in communities where opium usage rates are highest. Villages that once governed themselves through councils of respected elders now struggle to find leaders who can maintain consistent focus on community needs. Markets that once operated according to established customs now function with less predictability and stability. The journey itself illustrates the economic transformation that opium has produced. The roads and waterways that once primarily carried Chinese goods to international markets now also serve to distribute foreign products throughout Chinese territory. Commercial networks that once spread Chinese prosperity now also spread Chinese dependence on foreign supplies. You arrive in Canton to find Commissioner Lin already working with the systematic efficiency that characterizes Chinese administration at its finest. He has established comprehensive information-gathering operations that document every aspect of the opium trade: who imports it, who distributes it, who profits from it, and how the commercial networks operate. Lin's strategy demonstrates both sophistication and determination. He will offer British merchants clear choices between discontinuing opium-related activities and facing the full application of Chinese law. Those who cooperate will be welcome to continue legitimate commerce. Those who refuse will be treated as violators of Chinese law and disturbers of Chinese social order. You observe one of Lin's meetings with British merchants, and the cultural differences become immediately apparent. The British, accustomed to conducting business in China through negotiation and compromise, are unprepared for Lin's moral authority and administrative competence. "Gentlemen," Lin addresses the assembled merchants with the calm confidence of someone who represents legitimate governmental authority. "You have been conducting business in Chinese territory under Chinese jurisdiction. Chinese law now clearly prohibits the importation and sale of opium. You will immediately cease all opium-related activities and surrender your existing inventories for proper disposal." Jardine, representing the British merchants, responds with the attitude of someone who believes commercial interests should influence governmental policies. "Commissioner, you must understand that the opium trade represents substantial investments by British citizens and contributes significantly to international commerce. We cannot simply abandon profitable enterprises because Chinese policy has changed. We suggest a gradual transition that allows for the orderly conclusion of existing business relationships." Lin's response demonstrates both his understanding of the situation and his commitment to resolving it. "Mr. Jardine, you describe profitable enterprises, but you are referring to activities that harm Chinese people for foreign benefit. There will be no transition period. There will be no gradual conclusion. These activities end immediately and permanently. The British merchants, who have spent years operating in China with minimal government interference, are clearly unprepared for decisive Chinese governmental action. They expected to negotiate, to find compromises, to continue profiting while making minor adjustments to accommodate Chinese concerns. Instead, they face an official who refuses to treat social harm as an acceptable cost of commercial profit." When diplomatic discussion proves insufficient, Commissioner Lin demonstrates that he possesses the administrative capacity to enforce his requirements. Chinese authorities implement comprehensive measures that effectively control foreign merchant activities until they comply with demands to surrender their opium supplies. You witness the containment of the foreign quarter, and it represents a remarkable display of Chinese organizational capability. Thousands of Chinese officials, guards, and workers coordinate to restrict all supplies to the foreign traders while maintaining perfect discipline and avoiding any violence or disrespect. The message is clear. Chinese authorities can control any situation in Chinese territory when they choose to act decisively. Inside the foreign quarter, the British merchants struggle to understand how their position of commercial strength has suddenly become one of legal vulnerability. For years, they've operated under the assumption that Chinese officials could be influenced, delayed, or simply outlasted. Now they discover that when Chinese government chooses to act with full authority, it can do so with overwhelming effectiveness. After several weeks of administrative pressure, the British merchants agree to comply with Commissioner Lin's requirements. In one of the most significant demonstrations of governmental authority over commercial interests, Commissioner Lin oversees the disposal of over 20,000 chests of opium, representing millions of pounds worth of inventory and months of supply for Chinese users. You observe the disposal process, which Lin has designed as both a practical measure and a symbolic statement. The opium is mixed with salt and lime to render it completely unusable. Then released into the Pearl River, Chinese officials perform the work with ceremonial precision, treating the disposal as a formal cleansing of Chinese territory. The scene is both encouraging and sobering. On one hand, it represents the most decisive action taken against the opium trade since it began. Chinese government has demonstrated that it possesses both the determination and the capability to enforce its policies against foreign commercial interests. On the other hand, the enormous quantity of opium being disposed of illustrates the massive scale of the situation that Chinese society still faces. Commissioner Lin addresses the assembled crowd of Chinese and foreign observers, and his speech captures both the significance of the moment and the challenges that remain. Today we have removed over 2.6 million pounds of harmful substances from Chinese territory, but our real work begins now. We must help our people recover from the effects of these substances, strengthen our institutions, and ensure that foreign merchants understand that Chinese hospitality should never be confused with Chinese weakness. The British merchants, required to witness the disposal of their valuable inventory, react with a mixture of anger and disbelief. They've lost substantial financial investments, but more importantly, they've discovered that their assumptions about Chinese governmental capacity were fundamentally incorrect. Jardine, watching his opium supplies disappear into the Pearl River, makes a prediction that will prove significant. Commissioner Lin may have achieved a temporary victory, but he's created a situation that cannot be resolved through Chinese action alone. The British government will not accept the treatment its citizens have received. This is not the end of the opium question. It's the beginning of a much larger international dispute. You spend your evening in a Canton tea house where Chinese merchants, scholars and officials are celebrating Commissioner Lin's success while discussing what developments might follow. Their conversation reveals both the sophistication of Chinese strategic thinking and the limitations of Chinese understanding about how European governments respond to commercial disputes. We have demonstrated that we can enforce our laws and protect our people, observes one merchant. Foreign traders now understand that they must respect Chinese authority and follow Chinese regulations. A government official expresses more caution. We've achieved an important success, but we shouldn't underestimate foreign reactions. The British have substantial economic interests in opium commerce. They may seek ways to restore those interests through approaches other than simple trade negotiation. A scholar provides historical perspective. Throughout our history, we've successfully managed foreign relationships by demonstrating the superiority of Chinese methods and the benefits of following Chinese practices. Foreign peoples who accept Chinese culture and Chinese law are welcomed as friends. Those who refuse are excluded. This situation should follow the same pattern. But this situation represents something different from previous Chinese experiences with foreign influence, and that difference will have global consequences. Previous foreign challenges to Chinese authority came from neighboring societies that lacked the technological and organizational capacity to seriously threaten Chinese civilization. The British represent something unprecedented, a foreign power with both the ability and the willingness to use military force to protect commercial relationships that Chinese authorities consider harmful to Chinese society. As you prepare for sleep in your Canton lodgings, you reflect on the complexity of what you've witnessed. Commissioner Lin has achieved something remarkable. He's demonstrated that Chinese civilization retains the moral authority, administrative competence, and organizational capacity to address serious challenges when leadership chooses to act decisively. The disposal of the opium supplies proves that Chinese governmental weakness was largely a matter of policy choice, rather than inherent incapacity. But you're also aware that the situation is far from resolved. The British merchants who lost their opium inventory haven't simply accepted their losses and redirected their attention to other business opportunities. They've returned to London to request government intervention that will restore their commercial position and prevent future interference with their profit-making activities. The opium question, which began as a British solution to trade balance problems, is about to become something much more significant, a confrontation between two completely different approaches to international relations. The Chinese believe that moral authority, cultural achievement, and administrative competence should determine relationships between nations. The British believed that economic advantage and military capability should determine those relationships. Commissioner Lin's success in disposing of the opium supplies has temporarily protected Chinese society from continued expansion of foreign drug commerce. But it has also initiated a confrontation that will test whether traditional Chinese strengths can prevail against modern European methods of international dispute resolution. Outside your window, Canton settles into a quieter rhythm than it has experienced in years. The disposal of the opium supplies has temporarily disrupted the drug trade, giving Chinese society a brief opportunity to recover from the systematic expansion of substance use. But the quiet feels temporary rather than permanent, like a pause before developments that will determine the future direction of Chinese civilization's relationship with the modern world. You wake up aboard a British naval vessel in the Pearl River, June 1840. The morning sun creates beautiful reflections on the water. But there's nothing peaceful about this scene. You're witnessing the beginning of what historians will call the First Opium War, though the British government prefers to describe it as a commercial dispute to avoid acknowledging they're using military force to protect drug trafficking operations. The transformation of the situation over the past year has been rapid and dramatic. Commissioner Lin's disposal of the opium supplies triggered exactly the response that some Chinese officials anticipated. The British government decided to use naval force to restore the commercial advantages of British merchants and prevent future Chinese interference with British trade interests. From the deck of HMS Volage, you can observe the Chinese coastal defenses that appeared so formidable from land but seem inadequate when viewed from British warships. Chinese fortifications designed to protect against traditional naval attacks prove insufficient against steam-powered vessels equipped with modern artillery systems. Captain Elliot, the British naval commander, explains the strategic situation with the confidence of someone who possesses significant technological advantages. The Chinese have impressive numerical strength, millions of people, thousands of vessels, fortifications that have protected them for centuries. But numerical advantages become less relevant when one side has superior technology, better training, and steam propulsion. The British strategy combines simplicity with effectiveness. Use naval superiority to control Chinese ports, capture key coastal cities, and pressure the Chinese government to accept British terms for resolving the dispute. Those terms will include compensation for the disposed opium, guarantees of future trading rights, and most importantly, Chinese agreement to allow unrestricted opium imports under international commerce regulations. You observe the first major engagement of the conflict as British ships approach Chinese positions at Chuanbi. The encounter illustrates the technological differences that make this confrontation so unbalanced. Chinese artillery, designed for traditional naval combat, cannot effectively reach British ships that attack from distances beyond Chinese weapon range. British naval guns, meanwhile, prove devastatingly effective against Chinese fortifications. Steam power allows British ships to move independently of wind and tide, giving them tactical advantages that Chinese commanders cannot counter using traditional naval strategies. The speed of Chinese defeats is remarkable. Fortifications that took years to build are reduced to rubble within hours. Chinese naval vessels that represent centuries of maritime architectural development are overwhelmed by ships that seem to operate according to entirely different principles. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the British success is its psychological impact. Chinese defenders, who have spent their lives confident in the superiority of Chinese civilization, are forced to confront the possibility that technological advancement might be more important than cultural achievement. You witness this psychological transformation in a Chinese naval officer named Captain Chen, whose vessel has been disabled by British fire. As he's rescued from the water by British sailors, his expression shows not just military defeat, but fundamental confusion about how such defeat is possible. "We are the Middle Kingdom," he says to his British rescuers, speaking more to himself than to them. "We are the center of civilization. How can foreigners with their different methods defeat the Celestial Empire?" His confusion is understandable for centuries. Chinese cultural superiority translated directly into military and political success. Chinese forces defeated foreign challenges through superior organization, strategy, and technology. Chinese officials managed international relations through cultural sophistication and administrative competence. Chinese merchants dominated global trade through the superior quality of Chinese products. Now suddenly, none of these traditional advantages seem relevant. British ships move faster than Chinese ships. British weapons have longer range than Chinese weapons. British industrial capacity produces equipment that Chinese manufacturers cannot match. The entire foundation of Chinese confidence, the assumption that Chinese methods are superior to foreign methods, is being challenged by British naval demonstrations. The conflict moves rapidly along the Chinese coast as British forces capture port after port with minimal resistance. At Dinghai on Zhoushan Island, you observe what becomes the standard pattern. British ships arrive offshore, demand surrender, and when Chinese officials refuse, demonstrate their capability to overcome Chinese defensive preparations. Chinese losses are substantial. While British casualties remain minimal at Dinghai, over 200 Chinese personnel are affected while British forces experience fewer than 20 casualties. The technological imbalance makes these encounters less like traditional battles than like demonstrations of superior capability. But the most concerning aspect of the Chinese defeats is the response of ordinary Chinese people to the collapse of their civilization's military effectiveness. In town after town, you witness similar scenes: confusion, disbelief, and desperate attempts to understand how the world could have changed so quickly and completely. In Dinghai, you meet with local merchants who watch British ships overcome their port's defenses in a single day. Their reaction combines shock at the immediate events with deeper anxiety about what Chinese military defeat means for their understanding of their place in the world. "We always understood that foreigners had different customs," explains a tea merchant named Lu. "But we assumed that Chinese methods were superior because Chinese civilization was more advanced. If foreign military capability can overcome Chinese military capability so easily, what does that mean for Chinese civilization?" This question troubles Chinese society as news of military defeat spreads throughout the empire. For centuries, Chinese people have organized their lives around the assumption that Chinese approaches in government, commerce, technology, and culture represent the highest achievements of human development. Sudden and complete military defeat by foreign forces challenges not just Chinese political power but Chinese identity itself. The psychological impact proves particularly severe among educated Chinese who have devoted their lives to studying classical texts that celebrate Chinese achievements. Scholars who have memorized thousands of years of Chinese history and literature find themselves questioning whether traditional learning has relevance. In a world where technological capability seems more important than cultural sophistication, you attend a meeting of Confucian scholars in Hangzhou, where the discussion reveals the intellectual crisis that military defeat has created among China's educated class. These men have dedicated their careers to preserving and transmitting Chinese wisdom, but they're struggling to understand how that wisdom applies to current circumstances. "Our classical texts teach that superior virtue will always prevail over inferior force," observes scholar Wang, a man who has spent decades studying Chinese philosophy. "But we are witnessing what appears to be inferior virtue prevailing over superior virtue through superior force. How do we understand this contradiction?" His colleague, scholar Zhang, provides an answer that reveals how some Chinese intellectuals are beginning to adapt to new realities. Perhaps our understanding of virtue must expand to include technological capability. Perhaps the classical texts were written for a world that no longer exists. This conversation represents the beginning of a fundamental transformation in Chinese thinking that will continue for generations. Traditional Chinese philosophy assumed that moral and cultural superiority would naturally result in practical success. The current conflict demonstrates that this assumption may no longer be valid, that technological and military capabilities can overcome moral and cultural advantages. The war's progression becomes increasingly one-sided as British forces move beyond coastal attacks to threaten China's most important inland cities. When British ships advance up the Yangtze River toward Nanjing, the ancient capital, Chinese authorities finally recognize that continued military resistance is impractical. "You're present at the negotiations that lead to the Treaty of Nanjing." Signed aboard HMS Cornwallis on August 29, 1842, the document represents one of the most significant diplomatic defeats in Chinese history. and its terms reveal how completely military defeat has shifted the balance of power between China and Britain. The treaty requires China to pay a substantial indemnity, 21 million silver dollars, to compensate Britain for the costs of the war and the disposed opium. China must open 5 ports to British trade, including Canton, Shanghai, and 3 others. Most significantly for British commercial interests, China must allow unrestricted opium imports under international free trade principles. Commissioner Qiying, who signs the treaty for China, does so with the resignation of someone who understands that alternatives no longer exist. Chinese military defeat has eliminated Chinese negotiating power. The choice is no longer between favorable and unfavorable terms, but between accepting British demands and facing continued military pressure. We accept this treaty not because we approve of its terms, but because we lack the capability to insist on different ones, Qiying states. Future generations will judge whether we made the correct decision under impossible circumstances. The British representatives celebrate the treaty as a victory for international commerce and free trade principles. Lord Elgin, the British negotiator, presents the agreement as beneficial for global economic development rather than an imposition of foreign control. This treaty establishes the principle that nations cannot arbitrarily restrict international commerce, he declares. China will benefit from increased international trade. British merchants will profit from expanded markets, and consumers throughout the world will have access to products they desire. This interpretation that forcing opium access represents a victory for commercial freedom illustrates how British officials have convinced themselves that their actions serve humanitarian purposes. The fact that Chinese consumers didn't request opium access until British merchants systematically created demand is overlooked in favor of rhetoric about commercial liberty and international trade development. You witness the immediate aftermath of the treaty signing as British merchants prepare to resume and expand their commercial operations under legal protection. The treaty provides guarantees that allow them to operate with unprecedented confidence and efficiency. Jardine, whose opium supplies were disposed of by Commissioner Lin 3 years earlier, is among the first to re-establish distribution networks in the newly opened ports. His attitude reveals how military victory has transformed British merchants from cautious businessmen into confident commercial operators. We now have legal guarantees that Chinese authorities cannot arbitrarily interfere with legitimate international commerce, he explains while overseeing the arrival of opium shipments that exceed anything imported before the war. The Chinese government has agreed to treat opium as a normal commercial product, subject to standard international trading regulations. The scale of the new opium imports is remarkable, where pre-war importation brought perhaps 40,000 chests annually into China. Post-war legal imports quickly exceed 60,000 chests per year. The military action that forced China to accept free trade has created commercial conditions that make previous opium trafficking seem modest by comparison. More significantly, you observe how military defeat has affected Chinese society's psychological resistance to opium usage. Before the war, many Chinese viewed opium use as cooperation with foreign interests who were attempting to weaken Chinese civilization. After military defeat demonstrates Chinese vulnerability, this moral barrier against substance use largely disappears. In Shanghai, newly open to foreign trade, you witness the rapid establishment of opium distribution networks that operate with the efficiency of legitimate businesses. Chinese merchants, no longer able to resist foreign influence through appeals to patriotism or cultural superiority, embrace cooperation with foreign commercial interests as a practical survival strategy. The psychological transformation is visible in individual Chinese people who decide to try opium for the first time before the war. Potential users might have been deterred by concerns about supporting foreign interests against Chinese civilization. After military defeat demonstrates that Chinese civilization cannot protect itself, these concerns lose their influence over personal behavior. You meet one such new user, a merchant named Wu, who explains his reasoning with logic that reveals how military defeat has changed Chinese thinking about foreign influence. If Chinese methods were truly superior, Chinese forces would have defeated foreign forces. Since foreign forces defeated Chinese forces, perhaps foreign methods are superior to Chinese methods. If foreign methods are superior, then foreign products like opium might be superior to Chinese alternatives. This reasoning is flawed. But it represents how many Chinese people are attempting to understand a world where their fundamental assumptions about Chinese superiority have been proven incorrect. Military defeat has created not just political submission, but intellectual confusion about how to evaluate Chinese and foreign approaches to life. As evening settles over Shanghai, you observe the city's rapid transformation under the impact of legally protected foreign commerce. The port, which was a modest fishing community before the war, is quickly becoming a major commercial center designed primarily to facilitate the distribution of foreign products throughout Chinese territory. British merchants are constructing warehouses, processing facilities, and distribution centers with the confidence of people whose investments are protected by international treaty. Chinese workers, seeking employment in an economy disrupted by war and political change, provide the labor needed to build the infrastructure that will facilitate their society's continued transformation. The irony is profound. Chinese people are constructing the facilities that will be used to distribute foreign products throughout their communities. But military defeat has eliminated Chinese alternatives. Cooperation with foreign commercial interests has become a survival strategy rather than a voluntary choice. In your lodgings overlooking Shanghai's harbor, you reflect on the magnitude of what you've witnessed. A conflict that began as British determination to restore commercial privileges has ended with the complete restructuring of Chinese society's relationship with international commerce. China, which for centuries controlled foreign trade through cultural superiority and administrative competence, has been forced to accept foreign commercial control through military defeat. The Treaty of Nanjing represents more than just the end of a war. It represents the end of Chinese civilization as an independent entity capable of determining its own policies regarding foreign influence. From now on, Chinese authorities will need to consider British interests before making decisions about Chinese internal affairs. The opium trade, which began as foreign exploitation of Chinese commercial relationships, has become a permanent feature of Chinese life protected by international law. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the situation is that this represents only the beginning of an acceleration in changes that were already transforming Chinese society. The 12 million Chinese opium users of 1838 represent just the first phase of an expansion that will now proceed with legal protection and military backing. Chinese society, weakened by years of gradual change and demoralized by military defeat, faces an intensification of the trends that brought it to this point. Outside your window, Shanghai settles into its new role as a center for foreign commercial influence in Chinese affairs. British ships unload their cargoes with the efficiency of legal commerce. Chinese merchants adapt to their new relationships with foreign business interests, and throughout the region, millions of Chinese people prepare to encounter expanded availability of products that will continue reshaping their lives in ways they cannot yet fully anticipate. You wake up in 1850, 10 years after the Treaty of Nanjing, in the city of Hong Kong, a place that barely existed in Chinese awareness a decade earlier, but has now become the symbol of China's transformed relationship with the international community. The British established this island as their administrative center, and they've developed it into one of the most efficient commercial hubs in Asia. Hong Kong serves as a perfect example of what the post-war settlement accomplished, a piece of Chinese territory that now operates according to international commercial principles. Serving primarily to facilitate trade relationships between China and the global economy, the city's prosperity depends largely on managing the flow of goods, including opium, between international suppliers and Chinese consumers. You walk through Hong Kong's harbor district, where the scale of international commerce has expanded beyond anything imaginable before the war. Warehouses stretch along the waterfront, storing thousands of tons of various products imported from British-controlled regions throughout Asia. These goods arrive on steamships that can cross vast ocean distances in weeks rather than months, making international trade more efficient and profitable than ever before. British merchants who once operated as cautious traders now function as confident international business executives managing global supply networks. Their operations combine the efficiency of modern commercial methods with sophisticated understanding of local markets and consumer preferences. You meet with Morrison, the merchant you encountered years earlier when international trade was a smaller, more restricted operation. His current position illustrates how completely the commercial environment has been transformed by legal agreements and technological improvements. We're no longer simply foreign traders operating under Chinese restrictions, he explains, with the confidence of someone whose business enjoys legal protection and governmental support. We're international merchants serving legitimate market demand under treaty arrangements that protect commercial relationships, Morrison shows you. Commercial records that document the substantial growth of post-war international trade. In 1850, various imports to China, including opium, exceed previous levels significantly. But these figures represent only direct imports to officially designated ports. Products also flow into China through numerous unofficial channels, distributed by Chinese merchants who have discovered that international commerce often offers better profit margins than traditional domestic trade. The economic impact extends far beyond direct trade statistics. International commerce has become the foundation of a vast commercial network that includes shipping, banking, insurance, processing, and distribution. British companies that began as modest trading operations have evolved into global corporations, with activities spanning from Asian production centers to Chinese consumption markets. We employ thousands of people throughout Asia in various production and processing activities, Morrison continues. We maintain shipping operations that connect Asian markets with global commerce. We provide banking services that facilitate international trade relationships. We've created employment opportunities, generated economic activity, and connected previously isolated markets with global commercial networks. This economic perspective on international trade expansion represents a sophisticated approach to understanding commercial relationships. British merchants have successfully presented their activities as economic development, international trade as global market integration, and commercial expansion as international cooperation. You leave Morrison's offices and explore the Chinese sections of Hong Kong, where the human impact of this economic development is immediately visible. The island's Chinese population consists primarily of people seeking opportunities in the transformed economic environment that has emerged throughout southern China. These migrants from various mainland communities work in Hong Kong's processing facilities, shipping operations, and service industries. They're building and maintaining the infrastructure that facilitates trade between international suppliers and Chinese consumers, often finding better economic opportunities than were available in their original communities. In a boarding house that accommodates Chinese workers, you meet families whose stories illustrate how international trade expansion affects traditional Chinese community life. The Li family moved from their village in Guangdong province when changing economic conditions made traditional farming less profitable than employment in international commerce. My husband's family had farmed the same land for generations, explains Mrs. Li. But international trade created new opportunities that paid better than traditional agriculture. Many young people left for employment in commercial centers. Eventually, there weren't enough workers left to maintain traditional farming operations efficiently. The Li family's experience reflects patterns occurring throughout rural China as international commerce expansion creates new employment opportunities, while traditional industries face increased competition from imported products and changing consumer preferences. Mr. Li, who found employment in a Hong Kong commercial warehouse, explains how international trade has provided his family with improved economic prospects. I earn more money in 1 month working here than I could earn in 6 months farming. We can afford better food, clothing, and housing. Our children can attend schools that teach modern commercial skills, along with traditional subjects. This economic opportunity represents one of the positive aspects of international trade expansion. Chinese workers often find that employment in international commerce provides better income and living conditions than traditional occupations offered. You decide to travel back to mainland China to observe how the expanded international trade has influenced Chinese society over the decades since the Treaty of Nanjing. The journey from Hong Kong to Canton provides immediate evidence of the changes that legal commercial protection has produced. Canton, which was the center of restricted foreign trade before the war, has been transformed into a major international commercial center. Various business operations, processing facilities, and distribution networks operate openly throughout the city. British merchants conduct business with the confidence of people operating under legal protection and governmental support. But perhaps the most significant change is in Chinese official attitudes toward international commerce that once represented a challenge to Chinese control over foreign influence. Local administrators who might once have restricted foreign commercial activities now work cooperatively with international merchants to facilitate trade relationships. You meet with Administrator Chen, a local official whose responsibilities include managing international commerce in his district. His perspective reveals how completely military defeat and treaty obligations have altered Chinese policy approaches to foreign commercial relationships. We have learned that cooperation with international trade expansion creates fewer problems than resistance, he explains with the pragmatism of someone who has adapted to changed circumstances. Our choice is not between allowing and preventing international commerce. Treaty obligations make prevention impossible. Our choice is between managing international commerce effectively and allowing it to proceed without Chinese oversight. Administrator Chen shows you the regulatory and administrative systems that Chinese authorities have established to manage international trade in their territories. These systems represent a remarkable adaptation to circumstances that Chinese officials cannot control, but must somehow manage effectively. We require international merchants to obtain permits, pay taxes, and follow safety regulations, he continues. We establish zones where international businesses can operate and areas where they cannot. We attempt to maximize economic benefits while minimizing social disruption. This administrative approach to international commerce management illustrates how Chinese officials have maintained their traditional focus on social harmony while adapting to circumstances that make traditional governance methods insufficient, however. You observe that these regulatory efforts achieve mixed results, because international commerce creates economic changes that cannot be controlled through administrative measures alone. Consumer preferences shift toward products that offer better value or convenience. Workers migrate toward employment that provides better income. Traditional industries must adapt to competition from international alternatives. You visit one of the designated international commerce zones that Administrator Chen described, and the scene reveals both the benefits and challenges of managed international trade expansion. The zone succeeds in concentrating foreign commercial activities within specific boundaries, but it also creates economic opportunities that attract workers and customers from throughout the region. Inside the designated zone, international businesses operate with the efficiency of modern commercial operations. Chinese entrepreneurs have learned to work with international suppliers using contemporary business methods. They maintain sophisticated inventory systems, serve diverse customer bases, and handle complex transactions with professional competence. The proprietor of one commercial operation, a man named Zhao, explains his business approach with the pride of a successful entrepreneur who has adapted effectively to changing market conditions. We provide high-quality products, reliable service, and competitive prices, he says, describing international commerce in terms of customer satisfaction and market positioning. Our customers appreciate consistency. They know that products purchased here will meet their expectations, without unexpected variations in quality or availability. Zhao has essentially created a successful business model within the international trade industry, serving customers who can afford to pay for superior products and services. His success illustrates how Chinese commercial sophistication has been applied to international trade relationships with beneficial results. We also maintain flexible payment arrangements for regular customers who face temporary financial constraints, he continues. International commerce creates predictable business relationships, so we can extend credit with confidence that customers will honor their obligations when they receive income. This credit system represents a sophisticated adaptation of traditional Chinese commercial practices to international trade relationships. Chinese entrepreneurs have learned to work with the regular nature of international commerce to develop business models that benefit both merchants and customers. You observe this credit system in operation as established customers arrange payment plans that allow them to obtain products immediately while promising to complete payments when they receive income from employment or other sources. The conversations reveal how international commerce has created stable economic relationships that benefit multiple parties. One regular customer, a former agricultural worker named Wang, arranges a payment plan that allows him to obtain products immediately while promising to repay when he receives wages from his employment in international commerce. I can complete payment when I receive my monthly wages, Wang explains, and I'm expecting additional income from a commercial project I'm working on. I just need flexibility to manage my immediate needs while waiting for my income. Zhao agrees to the arrangement, with the business judgment of someone who understands that Wang's employment in international commerce makes repayment reliable. The former agricultural worker has become a successful participant in the new economic opportunities that international trade expansion has created. This commercialization of economic relationships represents the natural development of international trade integration into Chinese society. What began as foreign commercial expansion has evolved into a comprehensive system where Chinese people participate in and benefit from international commerce according to their abilities and interests. You spend your evening in one of Canton's traditional tea houses, where elderly Chinese residents gather to discuss the transformation of their society. Their conversation provides perspective on the magnitude of what has changed and their assessments of whether those changes represent improvement or decline. I remember when foreign merchants approached us requesting permission to purchase small quantities of our finest products, recalls one elderly man. Now we participate as partners in international commercial networks that span the globe. Our young people learn international languages, work with foreign technologies, and earn incomes that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. His companion, equally elderly, focuses on the social implications of international commercial integration. International commerce has certainly created new opportunities, but it has also changed traditional relationships. Young people who once learned family trades now seek employment in international businesses. Traditional skills that took generations to develop are being replaced by international methods that can be learned quickly. This conversation reveals both the benefits and concerns that international trade expansion creates for Chinese society. While new opportunities clearly exist, they also represent departures from traditional patterns that some people value highly. The elderly men's discussion demonstrates both their understanding of current circumstances and their uncertainty about long-term implications. They recognize that international commercial integration has created opportunities that didn't exist previously, but they also worry about the preservation of cultural practices that have sustained Chinese civilization for centuries. Perhaps our grandchildren will find ways to combine international opportunities with traditional values, one suggests hopefully. Perhaps they will learn to use international methods to strengthen Chinese culture, rather than replace it. This hope for successful cultural adaptation represents one of the most thoughtful responses to international commercial integration, rather than simply accepting or rejecting change. Some Chinese people are exploring ways to benefit from international opportunities while preserving cultural elements they consider valuable. As you prepare for sleep in your Canton lodgings, you reflect on the complexity of the transformation that a decade of international commercial integration has produced. Chinese society, which once controlled foreign influence through cultural superiority and administrative restrictions, has become an active participant in global commercial networks that operate according to international principles. The international trade expansion that began as a solution to British commercial problems has become the foundation of a new form of international relationship that operates through economic cooperation rather than political domination. Chinese authorities retain formal sovereignty over Chinese territory, but their practical policies must accommodate international commercial interests that have become central to Chinese economic activity. Outside your window, Canton settles into the rhythm of a city whose primary function has evolved from traditional Chinese commerce to international commercial integration. The sounds of traditional Chinese urban life continue, but they're now mixed with the activities of a society that has become connected to global economic networks in ways that didn't exist a generation earlier. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this transformation is that it represents adaptation rather than destruction. Chinese society has not been conquered or eliminated. It has been changed through integration with international commercial systems that offer both opportunities and challenges. The opium trade that once threatened to destroy Chinese civilization has become one element within a broader pattern of international commercial relationships that Chinese people are learning to manage according to their own interests and values. While problems certainly remain, the extreme crisis that once seemed likely to collapse Chinese society has evolved into a situation that Chinese people are addressing through adaptation, regulation, and selective participation in global commerce. You wake up one final time, but now you're not in historical China at all. You find yourself in a modern setting, perhaps a university library or a quiet study, surrounded by books and documents that chronicle the story you've just experienced. The world around you carries echoes of everything you've witnessed in 19th century China, but with the perspective that only historical distance can provide. The Chinese opium situation that seemed so overwhelming and unprecedented when you experienced it firsthand now appears as one chapter in the longer story of how societies adapt to rapid change. International commercial integration and challenges that require new forms of response. Looking back, you can see patterns that weren't visible while events were unfolding. The crisis that began with British attempts to solve trade balance problems eventually became a catalyst for Chinese society to develop new approaches to international relationships, economic development, and cultural adaptation. The numbers that once seemed so shocking, 12 million opium users in 1838, 25 million by the 1850s, now appear as statistical markers in a process of social change that Chinese society eventually learned to manage. The economic disruption that seemed to threaten Chinese civilization's foundation became the stimulus for Chinese people to develop new forms of economic activity and international cooperation. Most importantly, you can now see that the story didn't end with Chinese defeat and social collapse. Instead, it became the beginning of a longer process through which Chinese society learned to engage with global systems while maintaining its cultural identity and pursuing its own development goals. Modern China bears little resemblance to the society you observed in the 1830s and 1840s, but the lessons learned during the opium crisis continue to influence how Chinese leaders approach international relationships, economic policy, and social change. The memory of foreign commercial exploitation creating social problems has made Chinese authorities particularly careful about maintaining sovereignty over economic policy and social development. Contemporary China maintains strict controls over foreign influence, limits the power of commercial interests that might harm social stability, and refuses to accept international agreements that compromise Chinese authority over Chinese territory. The historical experience of the opium crisis continues to shape Chinese policy approaches more than a century and a half after the last British opium ship left Chinese waters. But the broader lessons of the Chinese opium crisis extend beyond Chinese history to fundamental questions about how human societies protect themselves from exploitation while benefiting from international cooperation. The British merchants who created the Chinese opium crisis weren't uniquely evil. They were intelligent people applying sophisticated commercial methods to solve legitimate business problems. Their success demonstrates what can be accomplished when commercial innovation operates without sufficient attention to social consequences. The Chinese officials who initially failed to prevent the crisis weren't uniquely incompetent. They were educated administrators applying traditional governance methods to address unprecedented challenges. Their difficulties demonstrate how quickly established institutions can become inadequate when they face forms of change they weren't designed to handle. The tragedy of the Chinese opium crisis lies not in its specific historical details, but in its demonstration that human societies remain vulnerable to exploitation that targets their inhabitants' psychological and economic vulnerabilities. Understanding this vulnerability doesn't eliminate it, but it does provide knowledge that can help societies develop more effective defenses against those who would profit from human suffering. The story also demonstrates the remarkable resilience of human societies when they are allowed to adapt according to their own values and interests. Chinese civilization didn't disappear during the opium crisis. It changed. The changes were often painful and disruptive, but they eventually enabled Chinese society to engage with global systems while maintaining its cultural identity and pursuing its development goals. Perhaps most importantly, the Chinese opium crisis serves as a reminder that rapid social change, while often difficult and sometimes dangerous, doesn't necessarily lead to social collapse. Societies that maintain their capacity for learning, adaptation, and collective action can often find ways to manage even very severe challenges. As you settle into sleep in your comfortable modern environment, surrounded by the technologies and institutions that make contemporary life possible, you carry with you the memory of a civilization that faced extraordinary challenges and eventually found ways to address them without losing its essential character. The story of Chinese civilization's encounter with the opium trade serves as both historical record and contemporary reminder. It illustrates that social progress is not inevitable, that civilizational achievements can be threatened when they're systematically undermined, and that protecting human societies requires constant attention to the balance between openness to beneficial change and protection from harmful exploitation. The dragon faced enormous challenges, but it didn't fall permanently. From its struggles came knowledge about how to engage with global systems while maintaining sovereignty, how to benefit from international cooperation while protecting social stability, and how to adapt to change while preserving cultural identity. Perhaps that's the most important lesson from this historical experience, that societies can learn from their difficulties and use that learning to build more effective approaches to the challenges they face. The patterns that created problems for Chinese civilization in the 19th century continue to operate in different forms today. But understanding those patterns provides tools for recognizing and addressing them before they cause irreversible harm. Sleep well, knowing that you live in a world where the lessons of history are available to guide present choices, but also knowing that each generation must learn to apply those lessons to their own circumstances and challenges. The story of how China learned to manage the opium crisis offers hope that contemporary societies can find ways to address their own challenges while preserving what they value most. Sweet dreams, and may you wake to a world that has learned from the past to build a future that balances progress with protection, opportunity with security, and international cooperation with cultural integrity.